All right. So functionally, if you remember what bee space is, this is just a description of what bees do with various widths of spaces inside their hives. So the idea is that if the bees are inside a beehive and they're walking around on the comb, if they find a gap that is greater than 3/8 of an inch, what they will do is they will bridge that gap with a brace comb. Basically this guy right here. So they want to connect those combs for stability. So they'll just take them and pop them together. On the flip side, if the space is less than 1/4 of an inch, the bees will take that space and they will fill it with propolis. So propolis is something we're going to touch on a bunch as the semester moves along. It's basically bee glue. Bees will collect not just pollen and honey or pollen and nectar, but they'll also collect plant resins when they're foraging around, and they'll carry that resin around in their gut. And they can cough up that resin and use it as a glue to seal things really tight. And this can be a huge pain in the butt for beekeepers because, you know, you open up your hive and sometimes you can't get the top lid off. You have to pry it up with your bee tool just because of all the sealed resin.
So you would rather want it like beekeepers want it at 3/8 inch, rather so you could store more honey in them, or is there a difference?
Well,
that they wouldn't want that.
So what it comes down to is think of well, let me jump ahead and I'll answer that in just a second. So why does this matter? Why this matters is it allows beekeepers to design hives so that we can predict what the bees are going to do with the combs. So we sort of saw with the skep, if you remember, well, actually I can't. I don't have that on this presentation. If you remember, we had that picture of the bottom of the skep, right? And inside the skep, like there were just all these combs, and some of them were in nice neat rows, but then some of them were going sideways, some of them kind of swirled a little bit. The bees just fill up the space as tightly as they can. So with bee space, people basically said, oh, well, we know where to expect propolis, where to expect comb. So let's build structures in the hive so that the bees will build nice, uniform combs instead of building these willy-nilly. So the idea is, basically, who's seen like the inside of a beehive before? You've seen the pictures of it, right? Like basically they have those long wooden frames all in a row. That's the Langstroth hive, which is number 2, which we're going to jump into. But the basic idea here is that with this design, what they could do is if you have a structure for the bees to build combs on, say hanging frames like this, what beekeepers knew, this would be say like a little top block that's holding the frames in place, is that if this gap right here between these two combs, if that gap is bigger than 3/8 of an inch, what the bees are going to do is they're going to start building comb in between those two frames because it's just too big. And it's going to make the hive really messy. You're going to have to break that every time you want to pull the combs out. It's not going to be reusable. On the flip side, if that space is less than 1/4 of an inch, it's too small for bees to get in. So the bees won't even bother going in there to put in new comb. They won't put honey in there or brood or anything. It's too small. So what they'll do is they'll put in a whole bunch of propolis and they'll just seal that whole thing shut. And that's wasted space inside your hive. So the basic idea here was once people had this idea that as long as you space things out between 3/8 and 1/4, you know, you're going to get as much space used in the hive as possible. Now the application of this came along with Langstroth. There it is. This guy, oh, great. It's almost like someone was drawing bees on my board. There we go. This is going to take a little bit of getting used to. Well, I guess I can talk as I very slowly erase all of this. But anyway, Lorenzo Langstroth was a pastor and a bee aficionado, and he was kind of just considered a forward-thinking mind on bees in the 1800s, and what he was most famous for was he patented a hive design called the Langstroth hive. And the basic idea behind the Langstroth hive was that it was a series of boxes that could be stacked on top of each other, and if you opened up the boxes, inside there were a bunch of movable frames that could be pulled in and out of the hive that were basically places where the bees could build their combs. So advantages here. Basically, you had frames housed within a wooden box that could be open from the top, so that you could walk up to your hive, pull open the top, and have access to your bees, which is a huge advance over, say, the skep, where you had to turn it over and pull things out. The frames were designed by Langstroth to be spaced in such a way that they created ideal bee space between every single frame. So that ideally, every single frame is going to be an individual comb on both sides, so that you're getting basically 2 rows of cells of honey from each and every frame. The spacing was also built to encourage bees to build nice straight combs. So you didn't have combs that kind of curved around the edge. You wouldn't have combs built between the combs, so no bridges, no combs built up on the wall of the box. Everything was designed to go straight into the frames. And so the big advantage here was that now you could walk up to your box, open it up, you could pull a frame out, inspect the comb, basically check it for health, check it for the quality of honey, see how your bees were doing, and you could put it back in the box without causing any substantial harm to your beehives at all. So it basically just allowed the beekeeper to all of a sudden have a much more hands-on approach with their bees. So previously with skeps, you could think of people's beekeeping as being more like managed robbing. Like basically you provide the bee with a house, and then you ignore it for the rest of the season, and then you tear it out and you steal their honey. But at this point, people are actively managing the bees. They're checking on the bees' health. They're able to provide them with food. They're able to give them medicine, able to get rid of pest problems. So this is much more of what we would consider sort of modern beekeeping.
A question going back to like the bridge. So are the combs and things like that, when they build the bridge, are you still allowed, or you still get a yield from the bridge aspect? Because like when I think it's propolis, or what is it that they put in between?
So propolis,
I know they fill it up, but with the bridge, are they you still?
Yeah. So with the bridge, in theory, yeah, they could be putting honey in there, and you could get some honey from that bridge. With propolis, propolis is just resin. Some people eat propolis; they believe it has like health effects, like positive health benefits. I don't know if there's any research to suggest it does. But with propolis, it's yeah, that's just basically lost space. You could harvest it if you wanted to. Cool. So this is just sort of another way to look at a traditional Langstroth hive. So basically, this would be a side view of what it looks like inside the box. So here you see we have a box with a bunch of frames in it. The number of frames varies. Sometimes you'll see them as small as 8. Sometimes you'll see boxes with as many as 10. But this is a pretty conventional sort of build right here. If you were to pull the frames up, basically it's an empty space. What most beekeepers do is they'll provide bees with a really thin slice of beeswax in the middle that's imprinted with the shape of the cells that they want, and that basically just provides the bees with a template to build on, and it kind of encourages them to build quickly onto the surface. But here it's just a naked one where the bees are slowly expanding out into the empty space. And then if you were to look at this sideways, sort of looking in the box this direction, if we were to remove this panel with a handle, basically what you see is each frame has a thick top bar that rests on the top of the box, and then the comb frames are set up so you have about 3/8 of an inch in between them in every single gap, as to encourage them to build that space. And as it works out, 3/8 of an inch is just about the amount of space you need for 2 bees to sit back to back. So basically it's enough space so that you can have one bee working on this comb, one bee working on this comb, and they're not interfering with each other too much. Any questions about the Langstroth hive? All right, so if you get into beekeeping, you'll find that there's a lot of different hive designs. There's Langstroth hives, there's Dedant hives, there's the, in Europe, basically every single country has their own unique hive design. And in reality, they're almost all the Langstroth hive. It's just they have different sizes. So some of them are a little smaller, some of them are a little bigger, some of them have different numbers of frames. But functionally, they're all wood boxes with wood frames inside for the bees to live in. Yes, and we'll get into that sort of stuff later. Did they talk about a super? Oh no, but yeah, oh yeah, we talked about supering with the, yeah. So for example, the basic idea is that a hive box, a Langstroth hive, is basically a vertical system of keeping bees. So you can stack the boxes on top of each other to create more space for the colony to live inside of. When bees live in vertical spaces, they tend to put the brood and the pollen down in the bottom, and they put the honey up in the top. So the idea is that when you have a bee box, the bottommost box is going to be unharvestable product. That's where most of the bees are going to live. That's where the queen's going to hang out. That's where all the brood is going to be. And if you pulled it out, it would just all be cells with little baby bees in it. You couldn't do anything with it. But if you put a top box on top of that, that's where they would store the honey, and that would be your super. Sort of like we talked about the skeps, you could put a second skep on top that was your super skep, or your superior skep.
So would they stack them like 4 high? So that means like one, like one of the columns like going 4 down, and I'll be one colony.
Yeah, that's all one colony. So if you see, sometimes you'll see it, right? You'll see stacks that are like 4 high, or they'll like be huge, huge stacks. And that just means there's like a crazy nectar flow going on. So there's just a lot of flowers going on, and the beekeepers are trying to encourage the bees to store as much honey as possible in that hive. And so ideally, like the top 2 to 3 of those supers are all just going to be full of honey that you harvest. And then you can leave them, say, like 1 super on the top that's their winter reserve. So that's kind of what's going on there. If you put like 1 hive, you know, in the middle of acres and acres of almond, you might have to stack those supers up real high to accommodate them.
Does stealing all the honey, like, or pretty much stealing their honey, like, are they encouraged ever to like just leave that place and just go somewhere else?
Some bees are, and we'll get to that when we get to the second part of today's lecture a little bit. But there's a lot of different species and races of bees. Races, more like subspecies. And some of the bees are very skittish. And if you do open up the hives, they are more likely to flee and to go and find a new space. But here in the United States, we've mostly imported 4 major subspecies, and of those, they're all pretty chill about opening hives and hanging around. So the bees basically will just control their population size in response to how much honey store they have. So removing honey will just cause them to not grow as quickly. Anything else? All right, these are great questions. Honestly, in a class this size, I'm not particularly concerned with staying on schedule, and I'm okay with, you know, answering questions, so feel free to raise hands and interrupt. All right, and the last major invention that occurred was the invention of the spinning extractor in the 1865. So basically, this guy, Franz Ruschka, he was an Italian. He came back from a war. There were lots of little wars going on in Europe at the time. But he basically reasoned out that you could probably, we now have these frames of honey, right? So back in the day, if you collected honey from a hive, you tore out, you know, all the brood stuff, you got your honeycombs, and typically what you did was you mashed up the honeycombs with a big stick, and you put it through a filter, and you just collected all the honey. Or you just broke off chunks of the comb, and you sold it as a whole comb, and people would just, it was like a butter dish. You'd have a comb dish, and you just sort of cut slices of the comb off, and you'd spread it, wax it all on your toast, and stuff like that. But he reasoned, we've got all these frames with nice comb inside them. Couldn't we just, like, you know, cut the ends off and let the honey flow out? And so he created a spinning extractor. And a spinning extractor is basically a bunch of baskets inside a bucket, and those baskets are attached to a crank handle, and by cranking the handle, you can spin the baskets. Centrifugal force pushes all the honey out of the comb and onto the sides of the bucket, where it collects in the bottom, and you can just sort of pour it out onto a filter. And the nice thing about this is, in the end, what you have is you have a bunch of nice clean honey, but you also have your frames with all the combs still on them. And what you can do with that frame is you can just go and pop it right back into the hive, and the bees will reuse it. And what's nice about this is it takes time and energy for bees to make combs. That is beeswax, and that is energy they could be using towards making more bees, towards making honey, towards foraging. So by providing them with a nice pre-made comb, you basically eliminate all that work that the bees had to do. And so you are getting more honey by returning that comb to the hive. And what's kind of cool about this is that bees actually, if you were to look at a bee comb, so let's say we're looking at one of these frames and we cut off one of these little sideboards and you're just looking at the side. Basically, when the bees build their little combs, they're not just sort of flat like this. They actually angle down a little bit so that the honey stays inside their little cells instead of dripping out the sides when it's open. So what's kind of neat is it's angled like that on both sides. Oh gosh, geez, size disparity. You can load up a frame inside an extractor so that this side is facing out towards the bucket wall. And if you spin it, the honey will flow up and out of the cells this direction so that you can actually put all the stuff in sideways and do one good spin and get all the honey out in one go, as opposed to placing it flat. But we'll talk about extraction later in the semester. We'll go over various extractors. Hopefully we'll have something to extract. We'll see. Cool. Right, so point being that with the development of movable comb hives and extractors, we saw that there was a real explosion in commercial beekeeping. Prior to this, most people kept bees. If you were a farmer, you probably had a couple bee hives. But things tended to be really small scale because it was hard to manage a whole battalion of skeps that you couldn't open and clean, and harvesting was a pain. But with all of this technology, all of a sudden, it was possible for one farmer to say, you know what, all I want to do is raise bees and have 1,000 hives. Because you could open the hives up, you could extract them relatively easily, everything just became easier. And so this is really where we saw the birth of what is modern commercial beekeeping. And honestly, commercial beekeeping has become increasingly important because nowadays, we basically manage all of our weeds with herbicides, right? With Roundup-resistant crops, we basically just go out and spray everything, and that removed a really important resource for a lot of our native pollinators. It used to be that there were lots of native bees that would go out there and feed on the flowers from the weeds that were left in the fields, and you could depend on those native bees to pollinate a lot of our crops. But nowadays, we don't really have a lot of weeds. We've seen significant declines in native pollinators, and now growers are much more dependent on large honeybee populations to do their pollinating than they ever were before. And so we see a really big emphasis put on honeybees, as is evidenced by the article that we heard today, the sheer volume of bees that get moved in. That being said, with what, 1.7 million acres of, or 1 million acres of almonds, whatever it is now, there's no way that native bees could have pollinated all those anyway. That's like crazy almond acreage. All right. Before I jump into the next thing, any questions? With a note that we are going to cover all of this information in more detail as the semester progresses. Cool. So, let's jump into this next thing. So, apologies, this is our classification lecture. So, talking about what makes a honeybee a honeybee.
I don't think you posted this yet.
No? Thank you for the end note. It's going to take a second. right, lecture files. Sure enough. Right, they're teaching, beekeeping, presentations. As you can see, I'm keeping about one lecture ahead of you. Okay, that'll take a minute. But anyway, so, as a reminder, back in the 1700s, major advance in biology, right, was the establishment of the modern scientific naming conventions, or Linnaeus' system, right? Carolus Linnaeus was a famous Swede. I think he was Swedish. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. He was some old white European dude, and which is basically history science. He basically came up with the naming convention which we use for all animals, right? And you've got the kingdom. I'll just pull off there for a second. Phylum, class, order. King Philip came over for family, genus, species, right? King Philip came over for green snakes, all that great stuff. And we use that as a convention to basically understand how various organisms are related to one another. And in all fairness, it's all a little bit of nonsense because it's all basically human constructs. We can't, with 100% certainty, look back and say that organism A is more related to organism B than, say, organism C. We basically have to look at the morphology of animals, we have to look at their genetic code, we have to look at all sorts of things and kind of extrapolate how they are related to one another. The only thing that we can say with any level of certainty is a real division is the species, the very smallest organization. Because we can say that species are animals that look similar and can mate with each other and produce fertile offspring. But that's not even a super great definition because what about, say, bacteria or fungi that don't necessarily need to mate to produce offspring? But anyway, that's a whole can of worms that is beyond the extent of this course. The reason I bring up this system again is that when you start getting into bees, things get really complicated. You start talking about things like subspecies, infraorders, races, suborders, superorders. There's lots and lots of divisions that sort of split up the bees in the Hymenoptera. And so we're going to walk through those just so you have a really clear idea of what actually is a bee, and also so that when you go out and you talk with beekeepers, you have a basic idea of what are the major species of honeybees and what are the major subspecies or races that you're likely to encounter around about here. So I guess starting off, let's do a little bit of review. Does anyone remember, well, let's just fill this out for honeybees real quick. So does anybody remember the kingdom that all honeybees would fall in? Yeah, Animalia, right? So honeybees are animals, so they fall under Animalia. Anyone remember the phylum? That's the tricky one. Or actually, not really. It's the same phylum with all of the crabs and the spiders. Arthropoda. Exactly. Arthropoda, arthropoda, whatever the case. Arthropods, right? Hard exoskeleton, jointed limbs, basic features. How about the class? Sorry? Oh, Hymenoptera is close. That's the order. Insecta. Or hexapoda, hexapoda, depending on what resource you're using, but Insecta is the more accurate. And then, yeah, we already talked about the order. Hymenoptera. So, right, I'm just going to sort of fill this out as we run, because what we're going to do is we're going to move our way down to the bottom of the list through the rest of this lecture. But so, kingdom, Animalia, phylum, Arthropoda, class Insecta, order Hymenoptera. So this is where we're starting, and we'll move on through here. Admittedly, after moving all the way down to Hymenoptera, we've narrowed down the diversity of life a fair bit. But even within the Hymenoptera, we have a lot of diversity. Hymenoptera, as you may remember, is one of our big 5 insect orders, along with the Coleoptera, the Diptera, the Lepidoptera, and the Hymenoptera. And this is a really big group. It has the sawflies, the bees, the ants, the wasps, and overall there's well over 100,000 species in here, of which honeybees are only like 12 of those 100,000 species. So we've got a lot of diversity in here, of which bees represent only a very small amount. And this is also a group that's arguably the most beneficial order to humans. We talked about this a little bit in economic entomology, but from an agricultural perspective, basically Hymenoptera is good. You have occasional ant pests. Sawflies can be a problem in trees, but beyond that, most of them are just pollinating or parasitizing pest insects, and we like that. So bees are cool by most agriculturalists, or Hymenoptera. Yeah, and on top of that, this is the only group that has what we call eusociality, or basically the highest level of social organization that we know amongst living organisms. On Thursday, we'll talk about eusociality in more detail, so I'll just sort of leave it at that. But all of the eusocial insects are Hymenoptera, except for the Isoptera. Anyone remember the Isoptera are? Termites. Termites, oh boy, this is so great. You guys are so great. I love it. Beautiful. So yeah, termites are social. They are eusocial. There's lots of insects that have very limited sociality, like there are social behaviors amongst cockroaches, but they are not full-blown eusocial. And again, we'll talk about that on Thursday. So let's talk about some of these subdivisions. So, suborders. If you remember, a suborder is a division of orders, but it's bigger than a family. So it's kind of right in that in-between area. Within the Hymenoptera, we have 2 major suborders. We talked about one of them in economic entomology. You may remember this one. This is the Symphyta. Symphyta represent the most primitive of the Hymenoptera. They are the sawflies. They are the horntails. These guys are characterized by having unconstricted abdomens. So you may remember they do not have that wasp waist that we associate with most Hymenoptera. They're just sort of fat the whole way through. And on top of that, their larvae are caterpillar-like. So the larvae crawl around on the outside of the plants, they feed on the leaves. In horntails, they burrow in the woody material. But regardless, they look like caterpillars. Anyone remember how you can tell the difference between a caterpillar and a sawfly larva? Yeah, it's all about those prolegs, right? Caterpillars have the 3 real legs, 4 prolegs, and a clasper, whereas these guys have prolegs on every segment, all the way back. Now, the other major suborder, and the one that the bees belong to, is the Apocrita. So I'm going to put down here, suborder Apocrita. Cool. Now, the Apocrita is more so what we think of with the ants, bees, and wasps. It has that constricted abdomen, the wasp waist. They have membranous wings, even though not all of the adults have wings, right? We're talking about ants. Or even the little cow killers, those little velvet ants you see crawling around, those are actually wingless wasps, as opposed to ants. And their larvae are grub-like. They don't resemble caterpillars in any way. And then we get an even smaller subdivision. Within the Apocrita, there are 2 infraorders. So, plug this on here. Infraorders. The first of which being Parasitica. Parasitica is all of our parasitoid wasps. Now, Parasitica has largely been debunked as a biological category. It seems like, ideally, when you're looking at this sort of stuff, when you're looking at a phylum, a class, an order, whatever, you should be able to go all the way back in history and be able to point to a single organism and say, that is the ancestor of this entire order, right? The idea is that a single organism became a Hymenoptera, and then it diversified into all the Hymenoptera we know. We call that monophyletic, meaning one source of origin. Parasitica is clearly paraphyletic, meaning that there are lots of organisms that all became parasitic wasps independent of one another. And so we call this an artificial grouping. But the main point here is that even though it's artificial, it is useful to think of all the parasitic wasps as being related, because they are all very similar to one another. But from a beekeeping perspective, the more useful group is the Aculeates, or Aculeates. That's all I'm going to say, Aculeates. A-C-U-L-E-A-T-E-S. Aculeates are the stinging wasps. And basically, the difference between an Aculeates and a Parasitica is that they have modified their ovipositors so that they now are stingers. They no longer lay their eggs with their ovipositor in most cases. Instead, they use it for defense against other organisms. This is not found across all of them, but this is a very common feature within this group. And this is the group that contains all of the social Hymenoptera. So again, our bees, our ants, our wasps are largely in here, except for the parasites. So, kingdom, phylum, class, order, suborder, infraorder. Already really starting to get into these subgroups. And then, within the infraorder Aculeates, there are two major subfamilies. I was reading this chapter, I was like, boy, this is going to be a really fun lecture. They're going to love this. But within that, there are two major groups. And this is where the bees finally show up, right? We've gone through all this, and now we're at the point where there are bees. There's the first group, the Vespoidea. Anyone remember the Vespids? What they were? Who had a Vespid in their collection? Yeah, they're those wasps, right? I think almost everybody had a Vespidae of some sort in their box. But right, Vespoidea contains the wasps and ants, and then separate from that is Apoidea, or the bees. So that'll be our next one, the superfamily. Apoidea. So, this was the last of the major splits that we are going to see. The Apoidea and the Vespids diverged from one another around 100 to 120 million years ago. So, in terms of biological life, that's relatively recent, even though that was literally millions and millions of years ago. So now that we're here, this raises an interesting question. What on earth makes a bee a bee? What separates a bee from a Vespid wasp or from an ant? Anyone remember we talked about this a little in economic entomology?
The hair?
Yeah, the hair. That's a big one. So one of the things that bees have that separate them from the wasps and the ants and all the other Hymenoptera is that they are covered in hairs. And not only are they covered in hairs, but their hairs are plumose, meaning they are heavily branched. So that's what we're seeing right here in this image. That's a scanning electron microscope image of the hairs on the outside of a honeybee. And you can see those hairs have tons and tons of little hairs coming off of them. And the major reason they have hairs is because, there we go, is because these guys feed primarily on pollen and nectar. And so these hairs are heavily branched so that they get lots of pollen tangled up inside of them, and they can carry them back to the hive or to their, wherever it is they are living, if they're solitary bees. Typically, hairs will accumulate on the hind legs or on the bottom of the abdomen. So we'll be looking at plenty of hind legs of bees here in the future. But I just want to give you an image here. You can see on this guy, sort of right here on the bottom of the abdomen, you can see all those hairs hanging off of the bottom. That's a pretty common bee feature for storing pollen when out foraging. And on top of that, what sets bees apart from other Hymenoptera is that they exclusively use pollen and nectar from plants as their food source. So, if you're looking at, say, who's been at a picnic and you get a bunch of wasps buzzing around, right? Yeah. Wasps are generalist scavengers. So wasps really like soda. It's an easy sugar source. They like juice. They like all that stuff. They will go to flowers and feed on nectar and pollen. But wasps will also go after insects. Wasps like to feed on, say, grubs and caterpillars they can find. They'll go after your picnic, all that. Honeybees only feed on nectar and pollen, though admittedly they will go after soda if they can get it. I used to help out a professor with bees when I was in my undergrad, and we were in the middle of this small town in Indiana, and he kept the bees on the roof of the building. And you would just see the bees all the time in the garbage cans around the building, crawling in and out of the soda cans. And so, and the honey did have sort of a distinctly corn syrupy flavor to it.
I read an article of like honeybees like around a factory that makes M&M's, and like the honey was like all blue because of like the sugar sources that they were getting from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That happened. A guy opened up his hive one day, and the combs were all blue, and he was very concerned. And yeah, he did a little investigating, and I think it was an M&M plant, and I don't remember why, but for some reason they had a whole bunch of the powder they used for the coating and like reject M&Ms and stuff sitting out, and the bees were scavenging it, and yeah, got a bunch of the blue dye. And I think that the guy does that intentionally now and sells it as like specialty honey. So all sorts of different colors. But yeah, so that's bees, right? Main point of bees is bees are hairy, the hair is plumose, and they go after nectar and pollen exclusively. They don't bother with other stuff. And I guess one final point to point out is that the hair has to be plumose. If you look at wasps up close and some ants, they will be hairy and they'll have bristles. But those bristles typically are just standard little bristles. They aren't plumose, they're not very dense, they're not built for carrying pollen. Now, this actually brings us to sort of an interesting point, just historically, which is that basically insects and the evolution of bees are considered to be one of the most important events to occur in terms of plant diversity. Because prior to the existence, well, let's take a jump back, right? Major division in plants, right? You have angiosperms, you have gymnosperms, right? Gymnosperms being plants that have cones. They produce pollen and use wind to pollinate one another. These would be like your pine trees, your cycads, odds and ends like that, right? Gymnosperms are the most ancient of plants. And then we have angiosperms, the flowering plants, right? Flowering plants make up the vast majority of plant diversity and are basically almost all of the plants that we harvest as crops nowadays. Angiosperms are also the plants that tend to be highly dependent on insects for pollination services. And functionally, what people found was that when they looked back using sort of genetic techniques as well as fossil techniques, and they looked at when do plants start diversifying, when do we see angiosperms occur and explode in diversity, versus when do we see insects explode in diversity, that the two time periods overlapped really well. And in particular, what we see is that bees emerged approximately 100 to 120 million years ago. And on top of that, eudicots, right? The eudicots versus the monocots, right? Dicots and monocots, right? Dicots emerged 125 million years ago. And this is a particular variety of plant that is extra specialized for bee pollination. They tend to have floral resources that have nectar, highly available pollen, sticky structured pollen. And what we tend to see is that right at the same time, these two explode in diversity. And someone just did an interesting study where basically they looked at the fossil record and they compared major pollinating insects before and after eudicot showed up. And they found that prior to eudicot evolution, there was a lot of pollination. There were various insects that were visiting gymnosperms, were visiting monocots, and were providing pollination services, though they tended to be flies, cockroaches, and beetles, generally larger things that would walk across the plants and sort of manually transport that way. But with the emergence of dicots, we saw what had previously been a very small group of insects, the Hymenoptera, really explode in diversity. So here we just have time moving forward, so going from late in history to earlier in history. The Albion gap is where eudicots appeared. You can see once eudicots appear, eudicots explode. They start causing major reductions in the number of gymnosperms because they're better competitors. And we saw reductions in total fly, beetle, and cockroach diversity, while bees exploded. So just sort of an interesting overlap that happened together. And just to show that in a different way, this is plant diversity of the major groups. So ginkgos, conifers, cycads, and angiosperms up here. And if we were to overlay the period in which bees appeared, it's basically right here, during this event in which plant diversity exploded. And similarly, bees show up right there in this version of that figure. So again, angiosperms being here in red. So point being that the emergence of bees appears to be a really critical factor in the diversity of plants in the emergence. And then there's also kind of this chicken-egg question. Basically, did the emergence of bees drive plant diversity, or did the emergence of plants drive bee diversity, or is it kind of a hybrid between the two? Did the two help each other out? You have a question?
I did drop it like right after.
I have no clue. Sorry, I don't have an answer for that. I saw that in this figure, and I'm not really clear on why we saw that. It's possible there was a mass extinction event there. But anyway, let's jump into the major families. Yeah, we have plenty of time. I'm so used to the 50 minutes. You guys would have been gone by now. You're stuck with me for another 25. All right. So there's a lot of families within the Apoidea. We're only going to cover the biggest ones and the ones that are most common in North America. And we're not going to go into great detail. There's the Coevolution, or the plaster bees. These guys are primitive. They are the most primitive bees, and they are solitary bees. And they tend to live in underground burrows. And this is actually really common for many primitive bees. When you go out, they oftentimes tend to dig burrows in the ground where they lay their eggs and provision their young. And they may show some really sort of super primitive social behavior, such as aggregations, where all the bees will be living in the same place, but they don't help each other with, say, provisioning food or taking care of young. So that's what we call aggregation. I've seen a lot of these guys when I'm out hiking the San Joaquin Valley Gorge. If you go out there in the summertime, you'll see little sandy hillsides that are just pockmarked full of holes, and there's bees coming in and out of them all the time. That's oftentimes these guys, or something like these guys, the Halticity, or the Halicity. The sweat bees. So sweat bees are the majority of wild bees that we have in the United States. Out on the East Coast, they make up somewhere between 60 and 70% of all wild bees. Here on the West Coast, their diversity is a little bit lower, but there is one important bee in this group in terms of commercial beekeeping, which is the alkali bee, or Nomia melanderi. These guys are sometimes raised in large numbers for alfalfa pollination. So if you're in an area that produces lots of seed alfalfa, you may bump into these ones. Major alfalfa seed production areas are going to be, say, Pacific Northwest. Here in the San Joaquin Valley, there's a lot of alfalfa seed production out on the west side, sort of the San Joaquin Helm area. And then Imperial Valley does a lot of seed production as well. And then the other major family that you're going to see for pollination services, besides the Apidae, is going to be Megachilidae. So Megachilidae are the leafcutter or the mason bees. These guys are kind of famous for their leaf-cutting behavior. So basically what these guys do is they will nest in open cavities. So they'll find, say, like broken reeds that have a hole down the middle. They'll find sticks that are hollow in the middle, empty gaps in rocks. Basically what they want is a nice little narrow straw-like structure that they can crawl inside of to lay their eggs. And typically what they'll do is they'll set themselves up in one of these narrow little tunnels. They'll fly out, forage for nectar and pollen, and create a little nectar-pollen ball. They'll take that ball and they'll put it in the very back of that tube, and then they will lay an egg on it. And then they'll go out and they'll find a plant, and they'll start cutting out almost perfectly circular little discs of leaves. And they'll take those leaf discs, take them back to the tube, and they'll start packing them into a little cup-like structure. So that basically you have a whole bunch of overlapping leaves. So if this is the tube, let's say this is the entrance over here. The bee will take the leaves, sort of stuff them in like this, and then they'll overlap them so that inside of this it's hollow. And they'll create basically a little cell of leaves that they will lay their next pollen ball in and lay the egg on that. And then they'll seal that up with a new leaf, and basically they'll create a row of cells all the way out to the end there. So that ideally in this little nest, they'll have, maybe 10 or so eggs laid, all in individual little cells made out of leaves. The mason bees, on the other hand, will go out and collect rocks and do the same thing, but they'll seal off the individual cells with rocks.
Like the pasture bees, like do they produce honey? Do they make honey like in the dirt, like on the soil? Like at all?
That's a good question. So typically when we're talking about solitary bees, like these guys, or these ones, none of them make honey. Honey is made almost exclusively by the honeybees, or a handful of the other aphids. But generally what these guys are doing is they will collect pollen, they'll collect nectar, and they'll mix the two of them together to create a little sticky pollen ball with sugary nectar inside of it. And they call that like a bee bread. And they'll use bee bread as their resource. And because they're non-social, and they basically take care of themselves, they're basically just creating a little provision ball for their offspring to feed on when they hatch. So yeah, functionally like inside this cell, what you'll see is you'll have a great big ball of nectar and pollen, and then attached to that, you'll have like a little tiny bee egg. And when this hatches, the larva will feed on that ball until it's all gone, at which point they will pupate and become an adult bee. And actually something that's kind of cool, right, about these leafcutter bees is they've got all of these cells, right? And ideally, each of these cells has its own pollen ball with its own egg on it that will develop into its own larva, but there's only one entrance. And so when they lay them, they have to lay them first in the back and then lay them moving outwards. So if these are the most recently laid and these are the oldest ones, you would expect that this would hatch first, correct? And this would be some adult bee that needs to get out. But through a mechanism that I don't understand, I just read about this, the bees actually will hatch in the opposite order. The most recent ones will develop the fastest and will emerge from pupation first. So that this one will leave, then this one will leave, then this one, and then the very first laid one will emerge last. And that way the bees don't have to disrupt each other when they emerge. Just kind of a really bizarre behavior. bugs are cool. So, these guys are characterized by having hairs on the undersides of their abdomens. So you can see that really nicely in this picture of the bee cutting it out. So he's got a nice big sort of puff of orange hair on the bottom of his abdomen. And there are a handful of really important pollinators in this group. Two of them that are relevant here in the Central Valley are going to be Osmia legnaria, the blue orchard bee. So these guys are really excellent pollinators of stone fruits and almonds, just like really top-notch pollinators. There was a study I saw where they looked at using osmia versus honeybees to pollinate, and they found that they were very comparable. It takes a lot fewer osmia to pollinate a almond orchard than it does honeybees. But what they found was the very best option is if you have honeybees and osmia, they pollinate the trees in slightly different ways, and you end up with much higher scent if you combine your bees. The other major pollinator is Megachilidae rotunda, or the alfalfa leaf cutters. And these guys are really effective alfalfa pollinators. People use honeybees to pollinate alfalfa flowers, and they're not very good at it. Honeybees are kind of big for alfalfa, and alfalfa flowers have evolved in such a way that they kind of droop, and in order to get to the nectar inside, the bees have to crawl up on the flower in such a way that the flower will dip and release a little bit of the nectar and then snap back up. And honeybees do not like that. They do not like being dipped by the flower. That makes them very nervous. Whereas the Megachilidae, they don't mind that at all. That's the sort of flower they're evolved to pollinating. So typically, if you go out to the west side during the pollination season, which is going to be like late May through June, what you'll see are great big trailers filled up with bees. And what these are basically alfalfa bee hives. So the bees are non-social, they all just live their own life. But functionally, what people do is they get big blocks of wood and they just drill a ton of holes in them for the bees to nest inside of. And so that's what you're looking at. These are big blocks of wood, and you can sort of see there's just hole after hole after hole all drilled inside this wood block, right?
So you said late May to June, but it's getting pretty hot around then. So like, can the bees survive easily in that temperature?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do fine. These guys do, at least. Some bees don't like the heat, but these guys are all fine. But functionally, right, this is just what you would see. It's kind of bizarre to walk in front of one of these things. These guys don't really sting, but I did an alfalfa project for a little while when I first got here. You walk in front of these things, you just see these bees like shooting in and out. Little tiny guys, too. But anyway, this is the inside. And so what you can sort of see here is this is an empty tube. This is one where the bee is actively building its cells. So what you can see right here is an empty cell. That's kind of big. We've got our pollen ball right here. So that's the pollen ball. And then this long, narrow guy, that's the egg, right? Yeah, shucks. Of course, the eraser's not as wide as the rest of it. And then down here, this is what the final filled nest is going to look like. And all you can see, right, is the overlapping leaf discs all the way down to the end.
These actually remember which holes there's.
Supposedly. I don't know that, but I assume they do. It's a lot of holes. And maybe they don't. Maybe it doesn't matter. With honeybees can recognize their own hives based off of color and pattern and the like. With these guys, I have no clue.
Is there some sort of size the hole has to be? Bee space?
There is, but I'm not aware of what it is. So I can look in and see what that is. But yeah, I imagine they want it to be small enough that they can fit inside. And you can see it's a pretty tight fit right there. For the most part, bees want something that's just big enough that they can fit in it, so it'll reduce any potential predators that could come in and, snap up their eggs or take their resources. That is an issue you see in bees, is bee robbing, where bees will enter each other's hives and steal the honey from one another. We'll touch on that in a little bit. So finally, we get to the bee family with the honeybees in it, which is family Apidae. So, family Apidae, which is nice and easy. Apidae are the long-tongued bees. So these are bees that are characterized typically by social behavior, pseudo-social behavior, and having very long tongues. Includes the honey, the bumbles, the carpenter, and the cuckoo bees. Cuckoo bees are ones I'm not super familiar with, but they're also called the parasitic bees, so I think they kind of take advantage of other bees for their young rearing. And within this, we have the genus that the honeybees belong to, which is Apis. So we're almost at the bottom. Apis. So, Apis are the honeybees. We're finally there. Honeybees are basically any bees that produce honey in large amounts in a conventional hive. They are comb builders, which is unusual amongst bees. As you saw in all of these bees, they tended to be pollen ball makers, but these guys actually make honey. Excuse me. What sets Apis apart from other bees are, one, they have hairy eyeballs. So if you were to look up close at a honeybee's eye, which we will here in a few days or a few weeks, you'll notice the eyes just have fine hair sticking out of all of them, all over the place. So nice, easy tell. They also lack spurs on their hind tibia. So this is the hind tibia of the honeybee. This is also what we would call a pollen press or a bee basket. It's used for carrying pollen. Consequently, they don't have any extraneous little extensions of exoskeleton and things like that. It's just very plain and built for carrying pollen. And then lastly, they have a long, narrow marginal cell on the front wing. Hey. So what that is basically that cell right there. If you were to look at a honeybee wing of any sort, they're going to have a nice long cell right there at the very tip that's closed. A lot of other bees, they have that, but it's open at the end, so it's not actually a closed cell. So these are all just features that are meant to help you physically identify the bees. Now, that being said, there is a fair bit of diversity within the honeybees. Not actually, that's patently false. There's not much diversity in honeybees. Sometimes you'll have these genuses like, say, Aphis. Aphis is one of the more common genuses of the aphids. Aphis has like 1,500 different species in it. Apis, the bees, have like 12 species. And of those 12, there's only a handful that are really big and prolific that are worth talking about, even in this class. So it's a relatively small genus. So we're going to touch on just 4 of the species, the 4 that are the most common and the 4 that are most relevant to modern beekeeping. The first of which is Apis florea, the wild dwarf bee. These guys have a distribution, well, it's widely speculated that honeybees first evolved in Southeast Asia and then just sort of spread across the Asian continent into Africa and Europe. So we find that most of the honeybee diversity is in Southeast Asia, and that is the case here with Apis florea. These guys are found throughout the Middle East and Indonesia. And basically, when they build their combs, they build a single comb on a tree branch, and it's super exposed. So basically, you'll be walking through the forest, and you'll just see, like, basically a little disc of bees hanging out on the side of the tree. And that's how they live their lives. They are relatively small. They're about half the size of, actually, they're about the size of a housefly. So incredibly small bees. They have this nice sort of chestnut color on the abdomen. And these guys, their stings can't puncture the skin. So conventionally, when people want to rob honey from them, people just walk up and snap these things off the trees. And that's perfectly fine. They tend to get away with it without much damage. On the opposite side of the spectrum is Apis dorsata, or the giant wild honeybee. These are the guys that I showed you the images last week, where they had the guys rappelling down on rope ladders and smacking the hives with the sticks to harvest the wild honey. They build a single large comb. It's typically up in trees, on cliff sides, or in some cases built on the sides of large buildings. And again, it's very similar in terms of just one large hive, and the bees tend to be very large and very aggressive. So much more difficult to harvest this. So this is found in Pakistan down through the Philippines. And this is just sort of a size comparison. You can see the hive itself is about the size of this guy's torso, who's trying to harvest it. But they can get much larger than that. I just couldn't get a good picture of a human standing beside one of the big ones on a cliff. So these can be basically human-sized combs full of brood and honey and stuff.
These bees like double the size of a honeybee, or
Maybe about 1.5 honeybees. So I have a little size comparison picture we'll see in a minute. But these are, yeah, relatively, I mean, probably, yeah, about that big. So big enough that you wouldn't want to really mess with them. All right, Apis cerana. This guy is the oriental, also called the Asian or the Eastern honeybee. And these are the bees that are most common in India, China, and Japan. And they've actually been cultivated in those countries for centuries. So this is what they would call Asian honeybees. And you'll hear about, I did an interesting insect at the beginning of economic entomology, right? The giant Asian hornets. Do you remember those? Great big hornets. And the honeybees had a falling behavior where they would surround the hornet, cook it to death by vibrating their wings. That was these guys. European honeybees have no clue what to do with Asian hornets, but these guys co-evolved with them, so they know that you swarm them and you cook them. But either way, these guys are a little small. They're about maybe 2/3 the size of a regular honeybee. And nowadays, in most East Asian countries where they keep honeybees, they keep these guys, and they keep them in similar hives to the Western honeybees. The hives just tend to be smaller, sort of scaled to the size of the bee. So you can sort of see that here. That here's a frame. You see the frame's a little bit smaller than you would expect. It's about as wide as the hand of the keeper who's managing it. So here we go. Here's a size comparison. We have Apis dorsata at the top, Apis cerana, so the giant wild bee, the Asian honeybee, and then Apis mellifera, the Western honeybee, right here in the middle. So you can see not a huge difference in size, but a little bit of one. And we see some difference in coloration too. Apis dorsata tends to be very dark. Apis cerana tends to be lighter. Apis mellifera is sort of a golden color. Which brings us to our final species, Apis mellifera. So that gets us to almost the end, unfortunately. So if we're looking at species, it is Mellifera. So Apis mellifera is a medium-sized honeybee, as we've already sort of gone over. These guys have been managed for the very longest time, millennia, literally. The first cases of beekeeping were with Apis mellifera, as best we can tell. Compared to the other groups, these guys have a real... I'm not done yet. I got a whole section after this. But these guys have a tendency to live in cavities. So, whereas most of the other guys we saw, right, were nesting on, like, the outsides of trees or on the sides of mountains and the like, these guys really like to find hollow logs. They like to find empty trees. They like to find holes in people's houses to live inside of. All right. So there's one more subsection I'd like to talk about before we go, and that is subspecies. Now, this is important because if you talk to honeybee keepers, nuh-uh. What? 9:15? Fine, get out of here. Fine. Sorry, I was snappish. Sorry, not sorry. I thought I was ready. But get out of here. I don't want to see any of you until IPM. Cool, we'll talk about the races and subspecies on Thursday again.